powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Now, live from inside the Matt Black Kia Studios, this is Football at 4.
Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast, and it is brought to you by PropSwap, America's sports betting marketplace. Sell your sports bets, take your profit. Find out how, PropSwap.com. Download the PropSwap app today. Geoff Mosher is here for today's edition of Football at 4. And the Eagles, Howie Roseman spoke down at the owners' meeting today. Some interesting comments from him. They made a signing over the weekend. We'll kind of recap the whole free agency period now that we are entering week number 3. Geoff Mosher, how are you, friend?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good, man, and it's good to be back talking. Man, a plethora of
things. It can't be good to be back.
No,
it cannot be good to be back.
You're right. It's not great to be back. I will be fair about that, but so much has happened. It's one thing to come back and have nothing happen. I mean, I came back to just like a laundry list of things to dive into, and I thought on Saturday. Now, Saturday, my flight was Saturday night at 9:40. So I had a lot of time to kill during the day. So we went out on like a boat and just kind of like hung out. While I was on the boat, the Eagles signed Kazir White, to which I was like, this might be the best signing they've made. I mean, they got a linebacker that can actually play, Geoff Mosher. So tell us how they envision him fitting in to this system.
Well, you know, I think we'll find out more, obviously, when the OTAs kick off. But here's what I think that, and I suspect based on some things I've been told about Kazir White and what he excels at. He's as you know, being a West Virginia alum, he's a former safety. So that means he can run a little bit for a linebacker. He's converted to linebacker. He can cover a little bit. He was not a starter for the Chargers automatically. He was a starter because a couple of guys got hurt. Kenneth Murray got hurt, but he did play well. I want to give him that credit. He played well. And we actually, on the pregame show before the Eagles-Chargers game, noted that this guy had stepped in and done a really nice job. Greg Cosell really liked how he was playing and gave kind of the lowdown on him. He had also started 10 games the year before. So he's a guy who can play. And the question is simply this. We know what he does. He's athletic. He can run. He can cover. Right. So to me, he's no doubt a part of your nickel linebacking core. When we say nickel, it means you have two linebackers on the field playing that linebacker role. Hassan Reddick, he'll be on the field on third down when they want to rush the passer, but probably more as a defensive end, you know, strong side linebacker against the run, defensive end as a pass rusher. So when they have their two nickel linebackers, coverage linebackers, off-ball linebackers out there, I imagine Kazir White is going to be one. And as we sit here right now, Davion Taylor, I would think they would like to be the other. You know, last year it was really TJ Edwards who was in that spot, but I believe that they see TJ as better fit as a rundown, like when they're in their base and it's first and second down, they need to stop the run, or maybe if it's goal line, or if maybe it's 3rd and 1. But when they need some coverage out there, Kazir White and Davion Taylor, I imagine right now is what they would like. Now they can draft a linebacker. We'll see what happens there to compete for that mix as well. But there's a chance that maybe TJ continues to improve and progress, and they feel like TJ Edwards and Kyzir White are their nickel linebackers, and that Davion Taylor is going to have to prove after 2 injury-plagued years that he deserves to be out there. So there's a lot of different combinations, but they've got some optionality. So I'm giving you what I think that in an ideal world, what that they would like. I think they would like, Edwards and Davion Taylor to be kind of out there with Hassan Reddick against the run, but then when it's time to cover and rush the passer, you have Kazir White alongside Davion Taylor.
Right. Now, you mentioned, draft a linebacker. Like, they haven't done that in 40 years. But if they brought in, like, a Lloyd, would you play, like, that means you essentially have your 2 starting linebackers from last year now in a reserve role.
Well, it's funny because, you asked the question, as soon as they signed Kazir White, I get, people asking me on social media, does this mean that they're probably not going to draft a linebacker in the first round? And my response is always like, only if you actually really believe they were going to draft a linebacker in the first round. I have never been of that belief. So I don't, you asked the question, so I answer it, but I really don't believe Devin Lloyd or Nakobe Dean are going to be Eagles unless they somehow slip into the second round.
So obviously they went that direction with Kazir White, and I would imagine they plan on having him start. Now, last year they tried to bring in a linebacker, the guy from Minnesota, Eric Wilson, who they end up releasing because he just didn't fit, and they went with Davion Taylor. So White they bring in. I think they envision him starting. Kind of then let's transition over to what happened with Derrick Barnett, because a lot of people are not happy. But I am kind of looking at this as an under-the-radar signing that I don't mind as much, because it seems that if they don't announce the money, it means he probably didn't get paid all that much. You got a 25-year-old guy who has had some moments. I feel like as a situational pass rusher, he probably fits that role much better.
Yeah, you and I are in agreement, and I want to make another point on Kazir White, so make sure we please lead me back to that eventually. But with Derrick Barnett, are you still there?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay. For some reason, the screen changed. With Derrick Barnett, I agree with you, Mike. If his name was not Derrick Barnett, right? If you can just look at this, as I wrote this on InsideTheBirds.com, if you can sort of separate this signing from what has appeared to be a run-it-back mentality by the Eagles, whether it is or not is up for debate. But if you just separate the signing and say this team had no bodies at defensive end once the new league year started, right? Because Barnett was out there in free agency, and the only guys under contract, like real contract, not futures deals, were Brandon Graham, Josh Sweat, and Teron Jackson. So a guy coming off Achilles who's 34, Josh Sweat who's good, Teron Jackson, a 6th-round pick who has to make the team every year. That's it, just 3 guys. So they were going to sign the veteran defensive end, probably on a short-term deal, just to have a body there anyway. So it just so happens to be the veteran defensive end that they signed was Derrick Barnett. Now, I know people say people are right. He's reckless. He's declining. He's regressing. That's fine. You can say all that. That's true. But they're not paying him anymore $10 million a year, or else that number would have been leaked, right? And he's now part of a rotation. He doesn't have to start. You've got Josh Sweat. You got Brandon Graham. There's no doubt in my mind that among their top 58 picks, of which they have right now 4, that they're going to be addressing defensive end or tackle or pass rush in some way. So to me, Derrick Barnett is a rotational piece that you got at a good value because he was out there in free agency for over a week and nobody bit on the money he was making.
Yeah,
so
agree.
But listen, I do understand. It's sort of like, it feels like the Odubel Herrera Philly signing, except without the off-field stuff. It's like you couldn't find any other defensive end that was cheap that you could bring in that at least isn't going to hit the quarterback late 7 times a year.
Yeah.
So I understand that criticism, but I also understand why the Eagles did what they did.
Oh, yeah. And keep in mind, like, I look at it like this, Jeff. You've got Sweat, Reddick, Brandon Graham, Milton Williams. He's almost like the 5th option now in terms of the rotation. And you don't know what you're getting from Brandon Graham. So if he has to play 20 snaps instead of whatever he was playing before, I don't mind Barnett at half the snaps, I guess.
Right. And that's why it's not, to me, a run-it-back approach with the D-line, because you didn't have Brandon Graham last year outside of 1.5 weeks of the season, and you didn't have Hassan Reddick. Now we're looking at it from a pass rush standpoint. You didn't have Hassan Reddick. Now you add that. That's about 11.5, 12 sacks a year average over the last 2 years. And then, again, you're probably going to draft an impact player, you hope, now, at that position.
Would you rule out them taking Ojabo now with this injury?
No. Wow. Because it's a 1-year deal for Derrick Barnett. You use the draft to build for the future.
No. I'm just saying because he tore his Achilles. So
I wouldn't.
Well, that's what I'm saying. The fact that you brought Barnett in means Ojabo doesn't have to play because we got Barnett to kind of fill that role for a year. So it almost makes me feel like it's more possible.
Well, the thing with Ojabo, Mike, is that the way he's built and his explosion, but also being raw, is I think we'd have to ask the Eagles if they saw him as a defensive end in Jonathan Gannon's defense or as a Hassan Reddick clone, a stand-up, strong-side linebacker who's going to be that 5th guy in the line against the run and then move into a defensive end / pass rusher or edge guy against the pass.
Yeah. Geoff Mosher.
We have to look at this line totally differently now. I think people really have to understand, like, even with defensive ends, right, they're not in the past under Jim Schwartz, they had all that space to work with, the wide nine, you can flex them all out, but you can't do that with that side, the strong side, the end anymore, because you have the linebacker right next to him. So you sort of have to, you don't have to, I mean, they can coach a guy to be that way, but I would imagine that they're looking for guys who have played in multiple fronts before, who are used to maybe playing a little bit more head up on the offensive tackle, like Trayvon Walker at Georgia, for example, as opposed to people who just attack from the edge and are used to all that space.
Yeah, so, you lead me down the path of some of the stuff that Roseman said today. He kind of said, hey, we had 3 first-round picks, and that kind of changed our off-season free agency plan, I guess. So, because he essentially said, we want our young players playing right away. So that was kind of something I thought that stood out to me.
Well, it's nice to say now after you struck out on 3 different guys in free agency. So that's nice of him to say now. But I mean, the bottom line is that, they did try to go for bigger fish in free agency, be it, whether it's Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson as a trade, or whether it's Marcus Williams, the safety, and we know that they were in it on wide receivers too. So look at that, I'm getting the national weather. You come back from Florida and your phone starts buzzing, right, Mike? You'll probably get it soon too. That snow squall warnings are in effect here. But
great.
The bottom line is that they it's nice to. I agree with them. They have these assets. They have the ability to get young players in. But they were also. It's not like that was their plan from the beginning. This team could have looked totally differently if a couple other things worked out.
He also kind of hinted at, I guess if I don't want to say hinted at, but I don't know. You read into it how you want, that they need to get more targets. That they want to throw the ball more, I guess. Right? Did you get that?
So I would think that they want to throw the ball more, right? I mean, they definitely went after some wide receivers, as we talked about in free agency. But their reputation, this is something that we talked about on the podcast this morning that dropped. And Adam and I both out at the Combine heard people kind of refer to the Eagles as a run-heavy team or a run-centric team. They saw the Eagles went from the most amount of passes in the league after 7 weeks to the most, leading the NFL in rushing from then on. And that's kind of that's how they cut their teeth, and that's how some teams looked at them. And so it's not a surprise if some wide receivers out there said, I'd rather go play with that quarterback or in that offense. So the Eagles did not get a wide receiver in free agency, and we'll probably have to do that in the draft. If they get one in the draft, you could see them being a little bit more open to being able to throw the ball.
They did get Zach
more.
Pascal.
Yes,
and
they got Zach Pascal.
Jason Avant was on with Josh last week, and he said he's essentially like a chain mover.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to say it. Yeah, slot receiver, big physical guy. Can do some good things in the run blocking game that you were getting from Arcega-Whiteside, but can actually, catch the ball and make a few things happen that J.J. Arcega-Whiteside was not doing.
Okay, so you mentioned wide receiver. I would still think they need an upgrade at wide receiver too.
Mm-hmm.
Does that happen draft, or we heard Devonta Parker's name? There's still some free agents out there. Do you think they're still kicking tires around some of these guys who are still sitting on the free agent market? Or does Howie wait till draft day? Parker's an interesting name in Miami. They got a lot of assets. They need draft picks down there. So trade, free agency, or focus on the draft?
I would think it's going to be draft first. And if things don't work out in the draft the way you want, then you go back and re-explore the trade market. I don't know that Devontae Parker is going to be traded tomorrow. So
I would think that would be something that happens on draft day.
Probably, or right after, when teams kind of reevaluate what they've got. Same thing with Preston Williams or anybody else.
Well, Jarvis Landry, you getting involved there? I know $20 million. You ain't paying him that.
The thing is, he's a slot receiver. He's a great slot receiver,
right,
but he really does not line up on the outside. You've already signed Zach Pascal. You have a couple of guys who can move into the slot. I think what they really have sought, we know what I know that they've sought and not yet really brought in, is that natural X wide receiver who can win on the outside.
Man, that wide receiver thing is going to be interesting to keep an eye on, because there are some names that are still available. And this is, they signed like LeGarrette Blount into May, when things happen. Like, it feels like there's still a lot of under the radar things they can keep doing.
Yeah, and that's what they've really been for the last 5 or 6 years, Mike. I mean, there really have not been huge players in free agency, and when they are, it's usually a guy who's entering his second contract that they want to, kind of add the nucleus and build around. And then the rest, they've kind of filled holes with 1 and 2 year contracts. That's what they've done. Some have worked out, some haven't. That brings us back to the Kazir White thing. They have not done a good job of that 1 year placeholder linebacker signing for 3 years straight now. Last year, Eric Wilson didn't even make it through the halfway through the year. 2 years ago, not their fault. Jatavis Brown, they signed him. He retired. Okay. 3 years ago, they brought in Corey Nelson from the Broncos. And the one common denominator between those, at least the two that didn't work out, one retire you can't help, but with Kazir White is those guys had played well within their scheme, and people thought they were getting that version of that player with the Eagles. And that's why I tell people, forget what the metrics say, all right? The metrics say Kazir White is way better tackler than Eric Wilson, right? Or way better coverage than some other linebacker. Okay, but that's in a scheme that is different from what the Eagles did, with talent around him that's different from what the Eagles had. Eric Wilson played well if you look at the stats, right? And he had all these tackles in Minnesota. He did not play well here because he was asked to go do some head-on tackling from deeper. The Eagles play their linebackers a little bit deeper, and he's a bad tackler, and he got exposed. Kazir White's not a big guy. So the metrics say he's a good tackler, but is that because, like Alex Singleton 2 years ago, he was a good sideline-to-sideline tackler? Or is he good head-on tackler in the gaps that you have to be when you're playing the style of defense the Eagles are playing? So I'm not trying to down the move. I like the signing. I think it's good. But every player should be evaluated with how they perform within that scheme. And again, Alex Singleton was a nice linebacker 2 years ago who made a lot of sideline-to-sideline tackles in Jim Schwartz's scheme. And we thought he was an ascending player. Last year, he got benched. All right. This has been I think the Eagles have to prove to you that they know what they're doing with this before you give them the benefit of the doubt.
Right now, see, the Singleton, he's just rotten in coverage. If it was 1996, he'd be pretty good.
But not just that. He struggled tackling because the way Jonathan Gannon plays defense, he has the linebackers back a little bit. He likes to play the zone. And then they have to get to the gap and make the tackle. But Singleton in Gannon's defense struggled to get off the big offensive lineman and get to the gaps in time. And that's a big part of why he was demoted. When they put Davion Taylor in, they knew Davion was more raw, but he's much faster to the block and be to the line of scrimmage, to the point of attack, to be able to make the play.
Yeah.
So again, we have to see if Kazir White can acclimate.
Right. So now you tweeted this out and said earlier that you think it will be White and Taylor as the first guys instead of Edwards and White.
Well, again, it depends what kind of offense you're playing, but nickel is the starting defense because nickel is the predominant defense. You're in that 60 to 65% of the time. But I say starter, a lot of teams still try to come out and run the ball once or twice before they get into like their 80, like the Eagles do that sometimes, right? So if the team comes out with 2 tight ends and a running back, 12 personnel, looking like they're going to run the ball, then TJ Edwards is going to be on the field. Now, who's next to him? I don't know. Is it Davion Taylor or Kazir White? I would think based on last year, the way they were using Taylor, it would be Taylor as long as he's healthy, right? And then you bring Kazir White when that offense, is done running the ball twice and wants to pass the ball for the rest of the afternoon.
That'll be interesting. And again, don't rule out, I guess, drafting a line. And that could even be in the second round.
It could be.
Right?
Adam Kaplan doesn't think so. We had an interesting discussion about that on the podcast this morning. I'm at least open to the idea that they might use a second-round pick on a linebacker like they did with Michael Kendricks.
Yeah.
And then Adam said, that was 12 years ago. And I said, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Well, they took Jordan. Well, that was the third round.
Third round, yeah.
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 Well, Adam will be on tomorrow. He is at the owners' meeting, so we will hear his insight on what he is hearing down there as well. Howie, again, stuck with Jalen Hurts. He's their guy. He is steadfast on that because they couldn't get Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson, or any other. Are they interested in Baker Mayfield?
Can't imagine so. Can't imagine so.
They are looking at quarterbacks. I saw Brian Johnson's going to check out Sam Howell today. He went. So they are looking at some of these guys. I know that.
Brian Johnson took Kenny Pickett out to dinner last week.
I was saying, when I was gone, I saw that they took Pickett out to dinner, and everybody was raving about Malik Willis's one throw that he just fired off of his back foot 90 yards.
Yep.
So you never know.
That's the pro day circuit for you. That's what we get excited about.
Well, we're almost in the draft month. Anyway, we are actually a month to the day. It's the 28th today. April 28th is draft day. So we're getting closer to finding out. Geoff Mosher, Inside the Birds podcast, new one dropped this morning, as you can listen to those guys break down the defensive end depth, the linebacking group, and some of the other storylines that are happening as the third week of free agency has gotten underway. Geoff Mosher, I will talk to you, pal.
Michael Gill, appreciate it. Welcome back.
Thank you, sir. Geoff Mosher from InsideTheBirds.com and the Inside the Birds podcast here on the Sports Bash Live, 97.3 ESPN.